So I named this presentation Joyful Abandon, but it's going to be a very interesting thing to see as we go along here, that abandon is probably not really the appropriate word. So we can debate that at the end. But what I'd like to start with is by asking, what is abstraction exactly? Because there are a lot of ways to understand it. One of the ways to understand it is that it means non-representational creation, and I'm using creation to mean painting or stitching or quilting or photography. That's kind of just a generalization. It could be color field painting, for example. It's any kind of artwork that starts with elements of line, shape, form, color, and value.
I'm not on video, so.
Somebody's not muted, though. Somebody's not muted. Okay, thank you. Another way to think about abstraction is, and this is described, if any of you are familiar with a book called Noton, The Light Dark Principles of Design. It's a relatively old book now. I think it was written in 1979. It explored a Japanese approach to abstracting and understanding design, which again is referred to as Noton. That book is still available, and if you're not familiar with it, it might be worth looking for it. We can always put that in the notes later if someone hasn't already put it in the chat. And from this angle, abstraction, somebody needs to mute, please. From this angle, we're talking about abstracting a thing that we would otherwise recognize, and you'll see some examples of that here too. So really what we're looking at first is how abstraction has evolved and when it was first identified. And believe it or not, only recently have art historians agreed that Hilma F. Klint, who was Swedish, was literally the first artist to put abstraction on the timeline, which preceded Vasily Kandinsky by a number of years. Her work has only just been shared with the public because she herself requested that the family not share her work until a number of years after her death. But for Hilma, everything meant something. She painted incredibly large paintings. I think they're 7 feet tall, if I remember correctly. And she never changed anything. She considered the paintings she created as being channeled. And she got the symbolism and all of the colors directly from what she considered to be seances with 4 other women artists. And her paintings must always be seen in relation to this context. She did keep a notebook, which is, I believe, in English and called Notes on Letters and Words Pertaining to Works by Hilma F. Klint. And she attempted to clarify the complex meanings of the signs and elements that she used. So for example, the snail or spiral represented the development or evolution. The eyelet and the hook, blue and yellow, the lily and the rose represented femininity and masculinity respectively. W stood for matter, U stood for spirit. The almond shape that arises when 2 circles are overlapped, which creates what we call a vesica Pisces, is a symbol of sacred geometry and represents the development of unity and completion. The swan, which she used a number of times in her work, her paintings, and I couldn't show them all because I could only choose the ones that were available for fair use in a presentation like this. But the swan represented the ethereal in many mythologies and religions, and in the alchemical tradition stands also for completion. In Christianity, the dove represents, of course, the Holy Spirit and love. Now, what's interesting about this is that she was very influenced by theosophy. Theosophy was founded by Helena Blavatsky. I have trouble with these names, so pardon my stumbling, even though I pronounce them over and over again. 1875 the Theosophical Society was founded. And Theosophy taught that the origin of everything, divinity, is inherent in every being. And when Hilma was painting these paintings, that was her fundamental truth. That was her reason for creating the paintings, in order to be able to share that particular thing, what she studied with the Theosophical Society, what she came to understand as the nature of human existence. These were painted in order to share that vision that she had. Now, Anthroposophy is a life philosophy that originated in Theosophy, and Rudolf Steiner was the leader of the German branch of the Theosophical Society, but he left it to form his own movement. And the two philosophies had a great deal in common, but his version had a stronger Christian element, and he had a great influence over Hilma F. Klint. She studied with him numerous times, as did other artists who are coming up shortly as we talk. But this is an example of her notebook and how she came to understand the color, the divisions, and the various elements that she used in her paintings. Vasily Kandinsky was Russian and born in 1886. His work also started as very representational, figurative work, but he gradually adopted elements that moved his work more toward what he believed was important about art, which was to express the same concepts that he felt were spiritual, for example, in music. In 1912, he wrote a book called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. And this really turned the art world upside down. And of course, a lot of people blew him off and didn't really go for it. But it was the first theoretical foundation of abstractionism. And he wrote in that book, the purposes and therefore the means of nature and art are essentially, and according to the laws of the universe, various and equally great and equally strong. And here's the cool thing. That's not his words, those are mine. He saw the creative process as the self-expression and development of spirit. And for him, blue was the color of spirituality, and the darker the blue, the more it meant an awakening of human desire to connect with the eternal. He founded the Blue Rider Group with Franz Marc, one of my favorite painters. And the artistic approaches of these people who were part of this group, which was located mainly in Munich, they believed in the promotion of modern art and the connection between the visual and music and spiritual. And I love this, the symbolic associations of color, but they also believed in a spontaneous, intuitive approach to painting. They were interested in medieval art and primitivism, and they were also interested in Cubist art, although that's not the direction they went. Instead, they moved toward abstraction because it served the purpose of being able to express the emotions that they connected with the elements that they used in their paintings. And another by Kandinsky. Now, Cubism was another version of abstraction that's a little bit like what we read about when we read this book on Noton that I referenced, because in this case, the Cubists were exploring a composition that we still recognize and the ability that they had to push it as close to the edge as possible visually, so that we still know what this is, but all of the fine details have fallen away in order to be able to appreciate the shapes and the form and the line, which are three of the elements, classic elements of abstraction. So Picasso and Braque were both exploring this and very intrigued by this at this particular period in time. But in addition to this, there were the fauves, which is French for wild beasts, and they had kind of a different take on it. They were trying to break away from Impressionism and working more with really strong painterly quality and color. And Matisse is an example of someone who worked that way. And then we come to the Dutch Pit Mondrian, who also began with very traditional, recognizable paintings, but became very utopian where his art was concerned. He was interested in a search for universal values and aesthetics. And in 1914, he wrote, "Art is higher than reality and has no direct relation to reality. To approach the spiritual in art, one must make as little use as possible of reality. It is opposed to the spiritual." And here I think is one of the first times we heard this term used. He continued to write, "We find ourselves in the presence of an abstract art. Art should be above reality, otherwise it would have no value for man." And to express this, he eventually went so far, and this is what we really know. This is when you mention his name, this is what we picture. We don't picture the landscapes that he did. This is what we associate him with. And in this particular style that he moved into, he eventually decided to limit his vocabulary to 3 primary colors, the yellow, the red, and the blue, 3 primary values, black, white, and gray, and 2 primary directions, horizontal and vertical. And this was interesting enough to him that he explored it for the rest of his career. And what I think now is that when we take this out of context, which is almost always what happens, when you see a painting like this in a museum, or you see it in an art book, rarely do you have the accompanying text that you need in order to understand that his work literally did have meaning for him, because it looks as though it's just non-representational. So I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. Our beloved Georgia O'Keeffe, her painting style was referred to as modernist, and it's a really good example, not unlike, again, what we could read in the Noton book, of taking an object and abstracting it to the point of it being either no longer recognizable to the viewer, as could be true in this particular painting, although she knew what it was, or perhaps taking a detail of a larger object and making that the entire painting, which would have been true of many of her flower paintings with which we are, most of us, very familiar. Jackson Pollock, one of the most argued painters, both pro and con, of that century, the one that preceded us. Did you know that he originally studied with the great Midwestern muralist Thomas Hart Benton? Thomas Hart Benton is best known for working during the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, during the Roosevelt years and World War II, when artists were literally hired in order to give them jobs and they had a place of importance. And it was, there are still wonderful murals preserved in the Nelson Atkins Art Museum in Kansas City that were done by Thomas Hart Benton, who eventually settled there after teaching in New York City. Jackson Pollock studied with Thomas Hart Benton, and his work was very figurative, very recognizable, until he started exploring what he called drip paintings, which is what we really know Jackson Pollock for. This is, if someone says that name to you, this is the sort of thing that you recognize. His paintings, these paintings, caused a huge rift with Thomas Hart Benton, who had been like a father to Jackson Pollock and saw this as a huge travesty to art. So they were separated, estranged from each other for the rest of Jackson Pollock's life. Whether or not that estrangement contributed to his alcoholism, probably at least in part it did. But he developed these poor paintings and he concentrated on this almost up until his death, although then there was a period when he went back to rather figurative paintings. But here's the interesting thing. In 1999, physicist Richard Taylor, who was also an artist, used computer analysis to study similarities between Pollock's painted patterns and fractals case you're not familiar with fractals, those are patterns that occur on multiple size scales. They just keep repeating themselves in nature. And this was driven partly by Pollock's words in a particular essay, I am nature. So this research team labeled his style fractal expressionism. And that research is still going on today, and recent research has actually focused on humans' response to looking at these paintings of his, because cognitive neuroscientists have shown that Pollock's fractals induce the same stress reduction in viewers as what happens if someone looks at a computer-generated fractal or a fractal that is found in nature. And how will we ever understand that any better? They can do all the research they want, but we don't have the guy here to ask him. But that's pretty interesting to contemplate. Meaning, still there. Painter Agnes Martin, here's her Night Sea. This was 1963. Sorry, it's not a better painting, but it's the only one I could find that was free use. And I would like to share this publicly. And I have to be careful of that, of course. But it's a blue background that you can see, but on top, what you can't really see is a meticulous grid pattern that was hand painted in gold leaf. And Martin spoke of how line to her represented innocence. She hoped that the feeling of innocence was transferred to viewers when they looked at her work. The simplicity of her images and the directness of her emotion, the emotion she wanted to communicate, was instrumental in bridging the gap between abstract expression and minimalism. And what does it come down to, everybody? Wanting to convey emotion on some level through the paintings. It could get to be an old story if it wasn't such an interesting story, because here we have Mark Rothko, 1903, born in Russia, emigrated with his family to the US, to Oregon. His original first paintings were urban scenery because, of course, that's what he was taught. And we all begin with what we're taught. In response to World War II, his art entered a new transitional phase, and he experimented, as is true in this painting, with mythological themes and surrealism to express tragedy. But of course, his work was morphing, and this is one of the paintings that was furthering the transition into painted rectangular regions of color, which he thought of as dramas. His desire was to elicit an emotional response from the viewer. And I found this interesting. In 1936, he began writing a book that he never completed about the similarities in the art of children and the work of modern painters. And of course, having a 5-year-old in the house painting, I found this fascinating. Her paintings are pretty great. According to Rothko, the work of modernists influenced by primitive art could be compared to that of children. And now think about that crazy phrase. My dad used it. Perhaps you know somebody who has looked at modern art and said, oh, my kid could do that. Who knew? Who knew? Maybe that's the whole idea. This is what Rothko's paintings evolved beautifully into. Amazing layers of paint and color that are evocative, peaceful, challenging. And toward the end of his career, he executed several canvases for 3 different mural projects. The Seagram murals were to have gone to the Four Seasons restaurant in the Seagram building in New York City, I believe. But he was disgusted with the idea that they would be decorative objects for wealthy diners. And he refunded the lucrative commission, and instead he donated the paintings to the museums, including the Tate Modern in London. And the ironic thing about this is that those paintings were installed in the Tate the day that he committed suicide. So he never got to see them. Helen Frankenthaler, excuse me. Everybody learns from everybody else, right? That's how this works. And she watched Jackson Pollock painting and loved the fact that he was working on unprimed canvas. So she started thinning her oil paints down with turpentine and painting and pouring in a way that was quite different from Jackson Pollock, but on unprimed canvas. And if you're not familiar with her work, you might go and take a look, because she was able to create very ethereal, beautiful effects. And again, much of what she did and how she approached her work was driven by her own emotional response to the materials, which is one aspect of this, in addition to wanting that painting in this case, but fill in the blank, that quilt, that stitchery, wanting that to have the emotional energy that went into the piece via the maker to be recognized or picked up on by the viewer. Her husband, Robert Motherwell, in the 70s, shook up the world of abstraction once again. Minimalism was sort of dominating things, but he created these primal, rugged, gestural paintings that conveyed energy and strength and anxiety all at the same time. This was about the war. There was a stoic strength to them, and yet a profound emotion that embodied the freedom of abstractionism. So what makes an abstract piece successful? And this is true no matter what medium you're working in. You know, when you look at YouTube videos, I actually found a YouTube video and I couldn't remember the name of the artist. I was just surfing around as part of my research. But obviously a very proficient, talented female artist I think in the UK. And someone posed this question to her, and she said, well, if you go on YouTube and you want to find out how to make an abstract painting, there are a lot of artists out there, and it's free, so it's fine. You can watch all that stuff. This is free. You know, what the heck? But throwing paint at a canvas doesn't make it a good painting. Pouring paint on canvas doesn't make it a good, successful piece. In order to really be successful, it helps for us to be aware of the elements that contribute to an abstract piece, because of course, when we're working, especially non-representationally, we don't even have the luxury of abstracting an object that we have in front of us and that we can recognize as something. We're creating something not out of nothing, but with these 6 elements. The more we understand what they can do and the more we understand composition, the better we are, the better we get to be at using those elements, right? But then I think it's obvious, which was never driven home to me as much as it has been by researching this and sharing it with you, that intention plays a role when you're working abstractly. And that intention can be one of two. It can come from 2 different angles, no doubt about it. One angle is that you just begin, you begin. And as you work with line, form, shape, color, value, and texture, you begin to understand what the painting's about. And at some point there's a shift, or what the quilt is about, or what the stitchery is about. You take a series of photographs and then you begin to understand what you really have in mind. But you have to do that work. You have to put in that time before it starts to be clear to you. That's a perfectly okay way to work. But then there's the other angle that you can come at this from. And when you're coming at it from the other angle, you already have something in mind that you want to convey. And in that case, you would do best to have your own personal language of color worked out. You would be well advised to work, which we'll do in CST next year, work a month with line, work a month with form, work a month with shape. Don't be in a big hurry. Work a month with color. And then once we've made it a month through each of these 6 aspects of making an abstract piece, then we think about a month of intention. What are we really after? Or maybe we're thinking about it all along. You don't have to be in CST to do this. I'm just suggesting that it's a really great place to be able to do what I'm describing, and that's what we're going to do next year. But the bottom line is that when your abstraction is really successful, you know how you want the viewer to feel when she looks at your work, and you understand the design elements and how to use them so you can make that happen. So if you think about it from that perspective, crazily enough, it isn't really joyful abandon. It's more like joyful intention. And who knew that that's where we would end up when I started this research in earnest and designed this presentation to share with you. This page is a necessary part of the presentation because it indicates where I got licenses to use particular images and when images were also in the public domain. And from the standpoint of not pirating images or using them inappropriately, this year I'll be adding this sort of recognition to each of the presentations that I create, unless all of the images, of course, are images that I produced myself. So here we are. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope it was informative and we still have time. Any questions about any of that? It's a lot to, yeah, believe me, it's a lot to embrace and think about. And I was thinking, I made a few notes here. You know, if one question was how to explore the ideas, of course, in that last slide, I suggested that one way to explore the ideas is to explore the elements one by one and get a handle on those, perhaps as a separate practice from what you already do. And in addition to doing that, I think I've used my three-legged stool frequently in the lectures that I give, so this might not be a new idea for most of you. But if you think about a three-legged stool, one leg is your materials that you use, and one leg is your processes that you know how to use. And the third leg is what we're really studying right now together, which is your intention, and that's driven by your preferences and what you really care about. And so I think an important aspect of working with abstraction, you can care about color and those elements, those 6 elements, and you can work strictly from that perspective. And that's completely acceptable. But if you're feeling stuck about where to begin and you already have a lot of tools and materials, maybe it's that third leg of the chair that would benefit from a little bit of study or thought or writing. I know for me in particular, that's been very useful. Barbara, a comment? Barbara, let's see, Doyle, and then Barbara.
Doyle. Well, I think excuse me, I think I've been approaching abstraction completely wrong. I always thought, I'm trying to do it and I'm trying to learn it, but I always sort of thought, you know, you look at a vase of flowers, all right, and you don't want it to look like a vase anymore, but you're kind of saying, well, I'm going to pick out what I think are the most important elements. Something that vase of flowers could not be a vase of flowers without 2 flowers in it. So I find it very interesting, this idea of intention and the spirituality. I mean, I always thought, oh, you have a vase of 3 red roses. All right, I abstracted by putting 3 red blobs on a piece of paper. But that's not what you're talking about, is it?
Well, you know me.
I don't know how to express this very well.
And you know how unintentionally obtuse I can be. Because the answer is always somewhere in between, I think. If what you're thinking is that you want to represent, you know, you could, I think actually what you've got there is a decent little exercise for yourself. If you had a picture of a realistic photograph of 3 red flowers in a vase. And tomorrow you're going to take a sheet of white paper and your paints, and you're just going to plop down some color that approximates the shape of the vase and approximates the fact that they're flowers. That's one way to do it. And maybe then your intention is to understand it a little bit better. You know, sometimes we have to we can't put the cart before the horse. We have to kind of, which is why I think, you know, of course I'm wedded to this because I'm the one creating it. But that's why I've come to the conclusion that if we spent 10 months talking about each of the elements that abstraction uses, if you Google it and look online, then maybe we get a better idea of how we could take a picture of 3 red flowers in a vase and change it and have a clearer sense of what we're doing. And maybe in that case, the intention is just to play with it enough to understand it all better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, okay. I just never realized that these artists, ones that you mentioned, were on kind of a spiritual trip.
No, I didn't really.
That's a whole new world.
Yeah, you know, I don't have a background in art history. I mean, I didn't go to school for it. I'm a psychology major and religion. But so maybe they teach a class like this in a university somewhere. It could very well be. But I sort of have a feeling not, because it's a little bit like, Zen and I were talking about this yesterday, which is a little bit, stick with me, it's not completely related to this, but it's a similar thing. When you go to art school, you learn about materials and techniques, and you get, you know, history and philosophy and all that kind of stuff. Does anybody ever really give you the tools that you're going to be able to use to be more creative? Does anybody ever talk about alignment and how important it is to determine your preferences, because that'll help you be more creative? Nobody talks about that kind of stuff. And I think we're evolving because people are beginning to talk about it a lot. But I think that's one reason that this whole aspect of abstraction has been slightly under the radar. And, you know, they didn't discover Hilda F. Klint until, I mean, people obviously knew about her, but her works weren't public until, I think it was either 25 or 50 years after her death. She didn't want anybody to see it until then. And her family honored that. And so nobody knew, nobody in the art world realized that here was this amazing woman working from that perspective. And so maybe now that we are aware of her, and she's a big, big deal, and her works are being shown all over the world in big deal museums. And by the way, they're all in the public domain, which I find remarkable. But the fact that the thread now begins with her and not just with Kandinsky, they can't blow Kandinsky off as just kind of a nutcase, which some people would. I mean, there's a progression here, and it picks up steam the more you see how many of these people really had this underlying belief system, and how much theosophy influenced a whole generation of artists. It's rather remarkable, I think. So, you know, when you go online and you look this stuff up, you realize that this hasn't been something people have been talking about for 50 years. And I consider it part of what's happening, because as human beings, we're evolving into a place where there's a lot more interest in spirituality, and there's less resistance to how that could have influenced things without making people just, you know, outsider. That's not really the right choice of words, because that has a meaning too. Without painting people as just kind of being oddballs. There's a thread here that's an important thread. We're not oddballs. So I just find that incredibly encouraging. So stick with me, Barbara. You're going to be here, and we're going to work on this next year. And I'll tell you, by December, you're going to have some great work.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take it out of the closet.
Yeah, Jane, this is something I've wanted to ask for quite a while, but when we are in museums, and I'll just use the one that's on Riverwalk in San Antonio, and I can't think of the name of it, but I took a picture of a sculpture of a Native American, and he's standing there, and it's just got this expression.
I
I
know
don't know
that.
if you made it. I didn't take a picture of the thing. And then I've got another picture of a face of a Phoenician mask that it's in Sicily. So there's no artist there. What kind of credit do we need to request or present, even if we're doing abstractions of emotional faces? How, is there any guiding principle there?
Well, based on the research that I've been doing on licensing and all of that,
Yeah.
it looks as though if you took a picture of something in a museum like that one, the San Antonio Museum of Art on the Riverwalk, if you took that picture, then you own the picture. And you can say in the collection of the San Antonio Art Museum of Art, but you don't have to ask their permission to use the picture.
Okay. Thank you.
And in general, I think that's true unless you're going to, which is what I was doing. I was looking for pictures that were online in order to put this presentation together. And a lot of the pictures I found were actually on Flickr, and they were pictures that other photographers had taken of paintings in museum shows in the Guggenheim and various places. And so the photographer owned the picture, but had a license that read as such that anybody could use the picture as long as they credited the picture to the photographer and the original source.
You also have to be careful. Jane, I'm speaking as a publisher here. This
Sure,
is Cheryl
great.
Christian.
Yeah.
You also have to be careful to read the licensing contracts. For example, there are oddballs out there. The Ashmolean, for example, if you take a photo, your photo of their work, you have to sign a contract that says that photo belongs to the Ashmolean.
Mm-hmm.
What?
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
there's all kinds of strange things out there. So be careful.
Yeah. Yeah. And when in doubt, which is what I did a couple times, I just took out a picture that I had and I found another one and put it in instead in order to be on the safe side, because the last thing I want right now is for YouTube to shut down my channel because I did something that I didn't even realize was wrong. And so
Exactly.
right now, I'd much rather err on the side of
Caution.
And if it's somebody who's alive, there was a big stink at the Houston Quilt Festival one year because somebody went in there and took pictures of all the quilts, and the next week they were on mugs and mouse pads for sale online, and that got shut down in New York Minute, and that was totally wrong. And when I have used poetry, I've said this to some groups before. Some of you may have heard this. When I've used lines from the Tao Te Ching or various places where I knew the author was still alive and it wasn't more than 50 years old, I always wrote to them, and I've always gotten permission to use it, and I've always credited them because I think that's one way we honor.
Yes,
creators.
agreed.
Yeah. Oh, Cheryl, thanks for chipping in there. I'm glad you had that to say. Let's see. Please, is it Jamila? Jamila? Pronounce it for me.
Well, most people say Jamila rhyming with Camilla, but strictly speaking, I think it's probably Jamila.
Okay.
It doesn't matter. I'd like to go back to the first Barbara. She started talking about the spiritual aspect of abstraction. And I have been struggling with this for years, but I've fairly recently, in the last 2 or 3 months, made a decision because everything in the world just got so horrendous. I've made a bit of a decision now to sort of withdraw quite a bit, retreat, let's say, from a lot of this terrible noise that's going on in the world and focus much more on the inner journey. So that's quite a difficult thing to do. And what I'm trying to do is, this is the intention, is to sort of express that inner journey in an outward way through my creative work, but only to myself. So I'm not thinking about the viewer and anybody else looking at it. They can look at it if they want to. I'm not doing it for the viewer. I'm doing it now entirely for me. And this is interesting because until recently, I hadn't understood, enjoyed, appreciated some of this abstract art. Now, all I want to do is work with informal colour fields and abstraction. And I think that's quite interesting, because it really wasn't my direction of travel, and it's not how I've made things until now. So you helped me with this a couple of years ago when we first started talking about it, but I've only just now got around to it. But one of the things that came up then, and I think it's really worth repeating and going back to, because I found it really helpful, was asking yourself, so I'm not starting from the materials or even the techniques, I'm starting from the essence of something. And that tends for me to resonate first with colour.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm starting with the essence, and I'm asking myself, why do I like this? What's this meaning to me? And then I've got to find a way to translate that into textiles, which is, I find it very at the moment. But it's just to share with other people. But I think you have to go about this in your own way. But I don't see how you can do any of this work, and not just the abstractive work, but any work, without actually putting something of yourself in it, however you want to express that. So just sharing that thought.
Well, I absolutely agree with you, and we have had many conversations, and I'm so glad to have a face to put with your writing now. So it's great to finally meet you in person, quote unquote. But I think you're right. I think that this is where it's so useful, and really what was creative strength training originally, the book, all about? It was about discerning your preferences and figuring out where you fit in the work that you're making, and believing enough in that purpose that it was always your starting point. And the viewer from that particular perspective and frame of mind is always secondary. And I find that the most satisfying way to work, and this is also related to the idea of sacred creativity. And in February, we're going to do a 4-part series on that, because we've just got fire lit under us. Zen and I working together is just fantastic. But I want to remind you all about the difference between commercial creativity, which is creativity that solves problems and helps people with things and takes care of them and invents things, et cetera, et cetera. The difference between that and sacred creativity, which is what you're describing, Jamila, and what we make for ourselves and for the path that it furthers for us personally on all kinds of levels. And sometimes what started out as sacred creativity just for yourself does reach a point where you want to share it with other people, but that isn't where it began. It began in your heart of hearts, and it unfolded from your heart of hearts. And then you make the conscious decision whether to share that or not. And so both of these are perfectly viable. And I believe there's actually a continuum. Sacred creativity is on one end of the continuum, and commercial creativity may or may not be on the other end of the continuum. But many of us slide back and forth on that continuum over the course of our creative lives, especially when we really find our creative centers and we own that, and we explode into going 5 directions at once, each of which has a different purpose, which we discern in order to protect each of those, if that makes sense. So thank you for your comments. I'm really glad you're here. Diane.
So between Jamila's question and your answer, you pretty much said everything that, and once you got to the commercial creativity versus sacred, it really clarified so much for me, because I was wondering about intention in the viewer and how it makes me feel my work when it's finished, but how I feel when I'm creating it, which is what you touched on. So I don't really need to say anything else. Thank you.
Oh, I'm glad you're here. And yeah, that's enough. More questions.
Yeah, I'm excited now to hear if you're in February.
Yeah.
Because that will be really interesting for me.
Yeah,
Thank you.
It's going to be so much fun. We're going to talk about the cornerstones of creativity, how those intersect with archetypes, and how they also become a set of tools that we can use. Like, we won't emphasize the archetypes so much, but we're literally working on a series of worksheets that can help people who would like to think about being more curious and would like to think about finding clarity and would like to think about finding community and feeling more confident. Because I'm just so jazzed at the idea that you can quantify this stuff. It doesn't have to be free floating anymore. There are actually things you can do that fine tune it for you so that you just begin to feel so much like yourself. You can't even believe how great it is. It's just
I'm
marvelous.
excited. Thank you, Jean.
Yeah, sure. Nancy.
Hi, Jean. You read about Theosophy, and there was a quote in there about that they believe that the art comes from within, from yourself, from your heart.
Mhm.
And so these, when somebody was talking about, she didn't realize that these art, I think it was Barbara Doyle maybe, didn't realize that these artists were spiritual, on spiritual path, but that is what the Theosophy is.
Mhm.
And so I had forgotten about Theosophy. And so when you read it, I did study some art history, but so I'm ashamed to say I forgot it. But anyway, it just brought it all back, because I think a lot of us are following that path, whether we know it or not, because we're working from our hearts.
Mhm.
And it's within all of us. And there are a lot of creative people out there that are mentors, not as good as you, Jane, but they are wonderful at talking about that we all have this creativity within us. And that's what I love so much about the program, because it really brings that out. So now we have the historical reference with Theosophy. And I was wondering if you can lay your finger on it easily, if you could read that part about Theosophy again.
Yeah.
And that's all I have to say.
Okay. Well, I can read it to you real quick because it's right here, but we can also put a couple of these quotes in the same email that has the link to this presentation. So you don't necessarily have to watch it again, but you could pick that up there. And the line that I think you're thinking of, I'll just start at the beginning. Theosophy is a general doctrine incorporating inspiration from various religions and Spiritism. The religions are regarded as different expressions of one fundamental truth. Theosophy teaches that the origin of everything, divinity, is inherent in every being.
There we go.
And
Thanks.
that's just summed up. That's the last line of my 7-line mantra. All is one. All is one.
Yes, all is one.
Joyce,
Thanks.
you're welcome.
Hi, Jane. About 2 years ago, I started working at the Mercy Spirituality Center here in Rochester, New York, and started teaching a class called Creative Meditation in Color. And this summer, we had a retreat for 4 days talking about art and spirituality. And I did a Visio Divina with the group using Pablo Picasso's The Crucifixion. And I only showed them part of the painting, and I did not tell them who it was or what it was. I left off the name of the artist. I left off the name of the piece. And I had them do the steps of Visio Divina to look at this piece and study it. And we did that for 15 minutes. And when we came back, the very first question I asked them was, how did you feel? And everybody said it made them very uncomfortable. And we started talking about it. And when I told them who it was and the symbolism that was in that piece that was spiritual and how he portrayed those spiritual images, the conversation was just absolutely fabulous, of people in that group realizing that art is spiritual. And it doesn't matter if it's a so-called quote unquote religious piece, or it is a piece that we look at that we do not think of as religious, but it could be very spiritual just because of the feelings and the emotions that it brings to you. So I've been on this journey for 2 years, looking for different things, different ways, different creations that people can do. And the classes usually start with either a scripture or with a reading that someone has found or I have found, and then trying to build our creativity around how that makes us feel. And the creativity could be like making a prayer wall or grateful cards. It's a varying different techniques, but it's all that idea of getting people to understand that inside of you is an artist.
Mhm.
All have different degrees that we work with, but inside of us there is that artist screaming to be let out.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Joyce.
Sure.
Yeah, and that's why I'm here this lifetime. I just want to help people figure out I just want to help women figure out who that is, and let's get
Yeah.
going with this thing, because it's great once we start going. It's just
Yes.
amazing. So thanks for that, Joyce.
Thank you.
Jill, I'm glad to see you. Happy New Year.
Hi, Jane. I have a question about those 6 elements from the very beginning and how it relates to the intention. And maybe the answer is different for every artist, but I was wondering, I make quilts, and I usually start with a color palette as a starting point. But at what point do the other elements come in, and should there be, I know should is probably a bad word in the art world, but is it wise to have some intention regarding all 6 elements, at the very beginning, or are those things morphing as the piece develops? Because I usually just start out with color and figure the rest out later, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah. Well, I think that's requires a longer answer than I can do to really justify the question, Jill. But I will say that I think the more I don't know whether you've ever had to learn a language, I suck at languages. I took 2 years of French and I can't speak French worth anything. But basically, I'm going to compare when you're learning verbs and nouns to when you're studying line and shape and form. You're studying the parts, and then it takes a while to put it all together, but you can. Eventually, you'll be able to put that all together, but it doesn't just happen overnight. And I think the long answer for what you're asking is that the more you study the individual parts, the better you get at speaking the language really well. And when you speak the language really well, then you have more successes than you have failures. And you also know what to do when something isn't working in a way that you might not have really understood when you were still kind of new at it. And I think, having watched your progression, that you're definitely on the right track, but it doesn't mean we don't still have work to do. And so that's kind of where we are with that, I think. But I'm not going to lose you. Don't worry. We're still on it.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. Thanks.
Sure. Catherine.
Am I okay? Now I'm there. I need to tell you that I'm just so excited. I'm jumping out of my chair. I have been working for a while in abstract without any of real intention. I certainly have studied all the design elements for about 10 years. But recently I've been doing bits, and then as I photograph them, I'm writing, what am I seeing? What am I seeing? What am I seeing? What is it meaning? What is it meaning? So now I'm getting to a point where I have finally identified, and this is the first time I knew that this was a real thing, that through the work I was doing, I was getting messages from the universe. And so I was beginning to think, okay, what does this mean, and write it out. And I am so excited to hear that, in fact, that is what we're going to be doing. And that's a real thing. I've been thinking I'm weird as hell. And my work is very peculiar because I do not start with an idea. I start with form and begin to manipulate that, and then afterwards try to figure out what it means. But it's so exciting to hear, because I have not been sharing my work very much lately. It's a very personal, very sacred, very exciting endeavor to go to the studio, not to make a product, but to hear what the universe is saying to me. So, so thank you. I'm just so excited to do this more.
Well, you're welcome. And the weirder you are and the weirder your work is, the better you're going to fit in.
Well, then I'm right there on the front page.
Because essentially there's room for everybody. If you've looked at any of our exhibition catalogs, you know there's room for everybody here, and it's all really good. And I know we're getting up in within 1 minute of the official end of this, but I'm going to take questions as long as they come. And if anyone needs to leave, I understand that completely. And I just want to say how totally blessed I am that you would take the time out today and be with me. I really appreciate it. And Catherine, you're going to have a ball with us. Marcy, glad you're here. I think you're muted.
Okay. Anyway, I wanted to actually piggyback what Catherine had said, about being weird. I'm a silversmith as well as a textile artist. And, some of the things that I used, I remember when I went to art school, was also trying to tap into the unconscious mind. And I think about surrealism. And I remember I designed a sterling bracelet based on Yves Tanguay's images, using my own images. And I think that can relate to abstraction too. I think it just kind of expands it. Think about weird things and maybe even using, some of Carl Jung's archetypes, as a basis for development of creativity. And intuition as well. So I just wanted to say thank you. And as you were talking about abstraction, my mind keeps, expanding. Thought, oh, what can I do with this?
Yeah, great. That's great. Good.
This has been a great series that you've put on.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're very proud of it. I'm glad you took time today.
Oh, this is awesome.
Lynn, Harold.
I don't have a lot to say. I was going to share a image of the book that you referenced.
Oh, there you go. Thanks.
Awesome. Great.
Yeah, great.
So there's a little bit of it.
Yeah, it's still in print, and it's a great book.
Well, I've had it for a number of years, but I love the book. It's wonderful.
And here's the thing about a book. This isn't directed toward you. If you get the book, guess what? It goes better if you actually do the exercises. Don't just read the book. That's true of everything. That's why classes are so great, because then you do it because everybody else is doing it and the teacher assigned it, and everybody wants to please the teacher because she's at the head of your committee, right? So if you get the book, do the work. But thanks for showing it. I really appreciate that, because I didn't think about putting it up until it was too late.
Oh, and thank you for making the analogy between learning a language and learning abstraction. I thought that was very apt.
Well, good. Thank you. I think it is too. Judy, glad to see you.
Hi, Jane. It's good to see you too. It's been a long time.
What's up?
Well, as you were talking, actually, this is perfect timing for a talk on abstraction for me, because I've over the years begun to pull away from all the structure and rules and everything of hand weaving, and trying to move into something that's very different and new and exploratory. And this move to Florida just sort of put all that other stuff on hold. It was a good time to switch. So as you were talking about the elements and intention, I was thinking more about the intention part of it, and how recently I did some tapestries that were just shapes and they were black and white. I didn't want to be abstracted by anything else. And also as a result of pandemic and everything that was happening, that's how I felt inside. was the black and white. But as I worked on the pieces and then put them together in a triptych, and I kind of got some fielders from some friends, what they were thinking about it. I may have sent them to you even, I'm not sure. I began to notice that what my intention in doing them and what spurred that work, I was getting feedback from other people, what they saw in them. And the intention began to change, not from my perspective, but from what the viewer saw in it, which I love. I think that's wonderful if people can relate to your work, even in a way that you didn't intend that to happen. So in thinking about all the artists you talked about, you know, I wonder how they'd feel about how we, you know, begin to, what we all see in their work. And, you know, that can be so varied. And if, you know, once you let it out there in the world, you kind of have to say, let go of your intention and say, this is what I did. What does the viewer perceive in it? So that's kind of a heavy thing to think about, I think, when you think that you get it out there in the world and it's like, you don't know how the world's going to see it, but your intention may be something totally different than people read into it.
Yeah. And, you know, I think, I don't know, I can understand how you feel about that and think of that as being heavy. But on the other hand, I think that's why it's so important that we work for ourselves, because then no one can ever take away the satisfaction of the reality of making it for yourself. And what happens after that is just letting it go and staying in present time. I don't have any other way of dealing with it. You know, I've told the story of going into a thrift store and I saw a piece of my own on the wall for 50 cents that somebody had spilled tea on. And the question always was, oh, well, you bought it to get it back, didn't you? And I said, no, I got the hell out of there as fast as I could. You know, what's gone is gone. This stuff's all going to go away. Dale Chihuly glass is going to break. Weavings are going to deteriorate. And the reason that we work is for the emotional connection to ourselves and the appreciation for what we've done. And we can think that it, you know, and that's on the sacred end of things. Obviously, if I do a commission, I've got a whole different set of parameters, and you've done work like that, so you understand that too. But when it comes to what people think about our work, it's a little bit like what they think about us. And we can't really control that, so why even spend 1 minute worrying about it? You got to be okay with yourself, got to be okay with your center. We all know this. But I really appreciate your thoughts, Judy.
Yeah, thanks, Jane. It's great to see you, and I appreciate your influence in my work. As I work, your thoughts are in my head constantly. So you've brought me a long way.
Well, that's a high compliment. I appreciate your saying that. Thank you very much, Judy.
Keep it up.
Deborah, glad you're here.
Thank you. I just wanted to say, did I hear you correctly? That you mentioned that you're thinking of focusing on these design elements in CST this coming year? I think that's very exciting. And also, I don't know if people are aware, but Wassily Kandinsky did write some books, and one is called Concerning the Spiritual in Art. And I think he went into a lot of color theory and the association between music and art in various writings in his lifetime. So people might find that of interest as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for mentioning that again. And you might even put that name. I mentioned it just in passing, Deborah, but if you'd put it in the chat, so if somebody else wants to write that down, it'd be great.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Christine. And then we'll close with Lori.
I just wanted to, everybody has said it. It's really exciting that we're going to do abstracts next year. I've been reading an awful lot about abstracts and thinking about them as well. And I have just a couple of book suggestions if people are interested. The first one is a tome, and it's called Ninth Street Women. And it's about all the expressionist women painters, Helen Frankenthaler, and all the rest of them.
Yeah.
It's a really heavy read, but if you read it in small chunks, it's really, really good.
Yeah, it's a good book.
It is a good one. And I think the thing that is said throughout that book that really got to me is that these women painters regarded painting as the thing. And they were more interested in exploring painting for the sake of painting than anything. And I thought that was a really strong statement. The other one is I think it's really fun. I don't remember how I found it, but it's called Picture This.
Oh yeah.
By Molly Bang.
Yeah. Yeah, I've used that book for years. It's a great book.
Maybe it was you that I got it from, but I got a copy of it, and it's like a children's picture book, but it's fabulous about how lines and shapes and colors and things influences. It's really, really cool.
Yeah, she really drives home the emotional quality of spires and sharp triangles and all of it in a way that's very, very effective and easy to understand.
Yeah, it is.
That's a great book. And as long as you're on it, if you're looking for Molly Bang, look for The Strawberry Snatcher. Oh my God, it's a children's book, but what a fabulous book that is. There are no words, it's all the drawings. And I went back and looked at it recently with my granddaughter. It became her favorite book. And the paintings and the stories that are being told are just such a great example of what visual artists can do. It's a knockout.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Christine. Lori, glad you're here.
Hi, thank you. I'm happy to be here and really excited that I've signed up for the CST deep dive. And as a preliminary to that, I've been doing the 12 days of archetypes and doing a lot of writing in relation to those. I find that really helpful in terms of soul work and really kind of getting in touch with what's in me. And I'd just like to say that I've been reading a book called 4,000 Weeks: Time Management for Mortals. And that was one of the things that got me to sign up for the course and make that commitment, because it's about really choosing very carefully how we spend our time, because most of us will only have 4,000 weeks here. So I'm just delighted to be with you and everyone else. Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah, I think it was the Moody Blues wrote a song called 22,000 Days, which is the same idea.
Yes.
If you like the Moody Blues, that's worth looking at YouTube to find. So, well, as usual, we're all over the place today, and I'm so glad. I mean, literally, you're all over the place, and we're all over the place. So this is good. Thanks for sticking with me as long as you have, and this will be recorded, and we will try to pull up some of the links, or I guess, at least the book title kinds of things, so that you have that all in one place. If you have any questions about anything, feel free to write to me, and I look forward to seeing you in February for the series that we're working on right now. And I'll especially look forward to seeing those of you who are in CST or thinking about joining CST or planning to be with me, because it's going to be a knockout year. So love to everybody. Stay safe. Have a good weekend and take care of yourselves.
Thank you.
Thank you.